In this video, we're going to take a look at the Hierophant card, and there's just so much to this card. I know a lot of people struggle with it, but there are some things about it that I think are important. So I want to tap into that and kind of really dive into the meaning of this card. So let's go ahead and get started. So this card, a lot of decks compare this card to the High Priestess, and you may in some decks see it called the High Priest. Now, I'm not really sure about that connection. I think it compares more to the Magician, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But if we compare it to the High Priestess, I think it's the opposite. It's the High Priestess is more inward, more about connecting to our divine spark and seeking inner guidance. And I think the Hierophant is more about external guidance. So from traditions, from books, institutions, leaders, things like that, and incorporating that into your practice in order to make progress. So they're just two very different things, I think. And there are a lot of things that hint to that on the Hierophant card. So let's take a look at it. On the RWS card, we have these pillars in the background. So the pillars in the High Priestess card are more about, they're more about bringing together opposites. So light and dark, just opposite polarities, and using those things to gain access to our internal world. Whereas the Hierophant, his pillars are more concerned with pathways on the tree of life. And if we look at the Tarot of the New Vision, we can see that this deck looks at the Hierophant card from the reverse perspective, and we can see that behind those pillars are two people. And those two people are holding two very different things. One's holding a serpent, and the other one's holding a dove. So they represent the two pillars on the tree of life, one of severity, which is represented by the serpent, and one of mercy, which is represented by the dove. And the Hierophant has control over access to all these pathways up the tree of life, but he does not control the middle pathway, which is the pathway of the camel, which I talked about in my video on the High Priestess. So if you haven't watched that, I do recommend looking at that to clarify some things here. But he's blocking that pathway, even though he doesn't have the authority for that. It's a false or illusory authority that he claims to have as a gatekeeper over that pathway. So you can see that he has these keys laid out in front of him, and those keys are a symbol of his authority and his right to give people access as he chooses. And then they're also crossed, so also blocking access. Now, the other thing about the Hierophant is if you look on the Thoth deck, you can see that his throne, or what he's actually sitting on, is a bull. So this card is connected to the energy of Taurus or Earth, but at the same time, it is the heavy aspect of that. There are a lot of different aspects of Taurus, a lot of different qualities to Taurus, but this is a more heavy and burdensome sort of dogmatic aspect to Taurus, which is interesting that it's blocking that middle path because it's hard to move. You have a bull there, so his throne is hard to get around. And to have access to your inner world is something that you should have access to, and no one has the right to do that. And so what I mean by that is a lot of times when it comes to understanding your connection with spirit, a lot of institutions will say you have to go through them to repent or confess or be washed clean, or you won't have access. So that's really interesting. And I think that, he represents that, and he stands in the way of our progress in that case. And I think that's the problematic side to this card that a lot of people struggle with. So we're going to move on here. And I think that he is connected to the Magician, and a lot of decks and a lot of artists and deck creators, I think, realize that. And I'll show you some examples of where I picked up on that in different decks. So in the Hermetic Tarot, we can see that they're both called the Magus. And the Hierophant on this deck is called the Magus of the Eternal Gods. And then the Magician is the Magus of Power. And so they're both these conduits, or these passageways between the spiritual and the physical. The Magus is more dealing with, or the Magician is more dealing with energy. And I like on the tarot physics, it also taps into that connection because it calls the Hierophant an electrical conductor. And so he is bridging the gap between the spiritual and the physical. And he has claimed that right to conduct that energy, to conduct those rites. He has that authority. He has that sort of priesthood or power to do that, which I think is wrong in so many ways, but there are some decks that really challenge that perspective. So let's look at that. So on the Tabula Mundi, or in the Thoth system in general, you'll see the 4 cherubic beasts here in the back. And that's a connection with the magician because they represent the 4 elements. Now, the magician normally uses those 4 elements. So you have the person's face there representing air. You have the eagle for water, which is Scorpio. Then you have the bull. And then you also have the lion, Leo. Now, also, and a little bit more direct matter, on the Carnival at the End of the World, if you look at the bottom there, you can see that you have all of the elements there as well. And one of those elements is a severed head. Now, that's really interesting because I feel that the severed head really does mean that it requires this blind faith to follow the Hierophant. There is this lack of autonomy when it comes to your spiritual progression. And the mind is devoid of, the mind is detached from your fellowship. So what I mean by that is you're not allowed to question, you're not allowed to ponder or explore, even if it doesn't make sense. So it severs the head. And you'll see that in a couple of other cards here as well. So let's continue moving on here. If we look at a few other things we have on the Triunfi, there's an aspect of the Hierophant that really does use a bit of manipulation, which is something that the magician does for control. And we can see here that you have these people who are dirty. They're trying to wash themselves clean. They have horns on their heads, so that implies a sinful nature. And the Hierophant stands above them, looms above them as this dominant figure to wash them clean or to make them worthy of being in the presence of the divine. And so it is this tactic of you being something that is less and dirty and sinful that is used to make you feel guilty. And guilt is a tool of the Hierophant. And I think people have felt that over the years. They felt that with religions. They felt that with organized religions, institutions, things like that, that don't allow for the flexibility. They're very rigid and dogmatic. I like on the Surrelist Tarot how you have this looming figure in the background. It's like, it looks like this enormous monument with a face on it that's heavy and just, I don't know, it has this sense of being dominating the entire card. But at the bottom, you have these people, and the people, again, are headless. They don't have heads, right? They're just these shadowy figures there. And I think that says a lot. It says a lot about how we view these organizations versus how we view ourselves, and how we also follow in this blind sort of devotion to it. Now, the other aspect of this that I think is interesting is the level of care, right? I think that, yeah, there are individuals and there are times where these institutions do a lot of good. And I'm not going to deny that. But at the same time, there is this contradiction between what they're doing and their position. It seems to conflict. So, for example, here on the Zombie Tarot, I find it really interesting because there's this zombie apocalypse going on, and there's a TV with a newscaster on there, a newsman. And if you look really closely, take a good look at his face. And, you know, he's smiling. And it just seems odd. It seems like there's some sort of weird juxtaposition going on here with his personality and what's going on in this world. It's almost like robotic, like he doesn't really care. And you have to question that you are getting information, but what is the concern there? And I found something similar in the Mystical Moments Tarot. I think it's Tarot of Mystical Moments, where you have this girl on a tree and she's talking to this owl. And the owl is, this big figure, way bigger than a normal owl. And he's reading from a book. Now, the thing that I noticed here, and I don't know if maybe it's jumped out to you as well, but look at the branch she's sitting on. That will snap. That is not secure. And yes, he's giving her the information, but at the same time, you're wondering, does he really care about this person? And I wonder about that. Is it more about control or care? And so there's a difference there. And that is the rift that I think a lot of institutions have with people, and where we have this conflict of really trusting these organizations. The contradiction also shows up in the Omega Land Tarot. This is another apocalyptic deck where you have chaos going on outside, and you have this reverend that's looking out the window very peacefully, calmly, and on his side he has a gun. Now, I don't know what to think about that, but I find that there's something about that just seems odd to me. Now, I do also like this card from the Japaridze Tarot, and it has a bat on it. Now, bats, there's good sides to bats, and then there's also the negative connotation that they get. And I feel that in this case, it's really honing into the vampiric nature of it, and how it's just kind of sucking all of the life force out of this bridge and destroying it as it goes up towards the light. So it's almost a selfish thing. It's like gathering all the information, gathering all the light, holding it, destroying the pathway, and now you're required on this vampiric bat to reach that light. That's a really cool abstract way of showing the nature of the Hierophant. Also, this card in Hebrew is associated with the number 5. And Hebrew, the number 5 means vow or nail. And its symbol is a V or a W. Now, on the RWS system, you'll see a W on top of his crown. And then on the Thoth system, you'll see that he has these nails in the background. They're not really that easy to see, but they are back there and they're a very prominent part of the card. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Now, on this deck, the Petra K Tarot, there are also these nails, but they're nailing the Hierophant to this podium or to this stage. And that, I think, is a hint at the dogmatic nature or the immovable nature of tradition and organized religion, where it's not allowing people to have this flexible nature and to be stuck in dogma and stuck in things that no longer serve humanity, because they're not able to really admit that these things are not logical, they're not making any sense, and they're not good for our spiritual progression. So that's something that's interesting there. Also, another thing to point out on this card is we have another severed head. So on top of the wand here, he has a head there. So again, he's taken away the freedom to think, right? There are no free thinkers there. They're all sort of hypnotized by this illusion. And that's why I associate it with the magician. So now it's not all bad with this card. There are some teaching aspects that I think are really important. We have, for example, shamans. Now, I think that there are some very wise people out there that have, through their experience, a good understanding of life. And we should honor that and listen to that and respect people that have been through things and established a strong foundation here on earth. And I think if we don't listen to that, we're very foolish. So that's one aspect of it. I think that, of course, with anything, people can be taken advantage of. But I think one thing to look for, or several things to look for. Number one is manipulation, right? Any guru or any sort of spiritual leader, if they're manipulating you, they're asking you to do something that you don't feel comfortable with, that's a big red flag, and just turn away from that. Also, they should be pointing you towards your inner core, towards your divine spark. If they're not pointing you in that direction and they're saying things like, oh, you have to tell me in order to be allowed access to this spiritual concept or to this spiritual progression, run. That's 100% blocking the middle pathway. So look for those things. I think that on a lot of decks, they will put Chiron there. So on the Circe Tarot, you have Chiron. I think that's a wonderful one to put there because this is someone who was a centaur or is a centaur. And normally centaurs are very warlike and violent. But this one, Chiron was educated and he became someone who really was an excellent teacher of math, of all kinds of concepts, philosophy, and things that really help people think and to open up their minds to new ways of thought. And I think that that's very fitting because he allowed that freedom to explore. You also have him on the 78 Tarot Mythical. I think I like the one on the Circe Tarot a little bit better because there are these people kind of worshiping him here. And I think that kind of conflicts with the idea of Chiron there. You also have just people that are teaching, educators. Okay. On the Science Tarot, there's a teacher there. There are people that are part of institutions that mean well, that don't really buy into all of the rigid structure. They're just trying to help people. It's important to learn the details about what you're involved with so that you're not perpetuating some sort of thing that is damaging in a lot of ways to people's freedoms, even if your intentions are to help. I think that's important to look at. What is the goal of what you're involved with? So we also have institutions. So if you have like a college professor, sometimes the things that go on at the university level can be scandalous. You know, there are people that get paid off to have admission into colleges, and coaches or different deans or people in certain places, they get donations, and just kind of people are influential. They have influence on these institutions and they allow for their children or other people to have access when they really don't have the merits for that. So there is this level of, I guess, gatekeeping that goes along in these areas as well. And we can't ignore that. So one other thing I want to touch on here is on the Thoth deck, there are some valuable things to look at here. Now, the Thoth deck, I think, really does take the Hierophant in a different direction, and it brings about a transformative perspective of the Hierophant card. So what I mean by that is there are three main figures on this card. The main one that you see with the beard there in the middle, that is Osiris. And Osiris represents the patriarchal structure, the things that I'm talking about mostly on this video, the organizations. And below him, down at the bottom, you have Isis. But this isn't the regular Isis. So if you read what the deck creators say about this particular Isis, is this is Isis returned with the sword. So she's returned with the sword, and she's no longer the regular Isis. She's now called the Scarlet Woman. And what she's doing is she's shedding light on the person that's right there on the chest of the Hierophant. That infant, that's the child, that's Horus. And so what this is talking about is this is talking about going from the patriarchal system to the child or the individual system. So switching aeons there to our personal freedom and power, where every man and every woman is a star. So I think that's pretty much it. Let's just look at a few more symbols on the card. We have this red robe that's establishing his power again. He's holding up his finger to give benediction or authority. He's giving you the authority to have access. That's another thing that he has there. The crown has 3 tiers to it, and then his wand has also 3 tiers to it, representing, on the RWS system, it really represents like the Trinity, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. But I think that's because Arthur Waite, who was influential in this deck, and Pamela Coleman Smith, they kind of had a religious or a Christian mysticism background. And so they kind of infused a lot of that in there. And so it kind of represents that. But if you look at the Thoth system, it goes back to more Egyptian philosophies and mythologies. And that those circles represent those 3 aeons, which I talked about on that card. So you have Horus, Isis, and Osiris as those 3 circles, right? And so that's really what that represents on that card. So those are some other things on the card. And so I'm going to go ahead and move on here now and talk about the element that's associated with this card, which is boron. And yeah, so if you're new to my channel, let me just explain a little bit about what I'm going to do next. Is I like to go through the periodic table and match up the cards with an element. And I go in order by the numbers, by the atomic number. And it's just a way for me to do a little bit of alchemy to try to see if I can bring out the essence of this element and see if it matches the energy of the card. It's an experiment that I've been doing since I've started this channel, and something that I really love incorporating into this channel as just a magical part of it for me personally. And so I just kind of love doing that, and just seeing where it leads me and where it goes is my way of exercising my freedom of thought, my freedom to express and explore how I feel is okay. It's not hurting anyone. And I just really enjoy doing it. And so to avoid a dogmatic approach to tarot, to avoid being so rigid and structured as far as what I want to do with it, I think it's a wonderful way for me to show that ability to make tarot your own. And you can do with it whatever you like and however you want to do it, and what works for you and is healthy for you and actually helps you feel good about something that you've created. And so that is the purpose of that. So you can join me here as I discuss boron and its connection with the Hierophant card. And boron is interesting, and I think it really does fit the Hierophant's energy. It has a green glow to it when you heat it in a flame test. And I think that matches the energy of Taurus. So we have that. We also have the ability to break rules. So the octet rule. It is a very important rule for all elements, but barium and boron will break that rule, which I think is interesting that the Emperor and the Hierophant will do that. In fact, the only place on the periodic table where there's a separation, a direct separation between elements, is between barium and boron, right? So it's kind of the separation of church and state. And then also, I find that, well, I guess kind of a little funny part to this is I was doing some research on it and I realized that, oh yeah, boron is in borax, which is a cleansing agent. It's actually in a lot of cleansing agents. And I talked earlier about how the Hierophant was about cleansing and making something clean so that it can have access to the spirit world. And that's interesting that this boron is in so many cleansing agents. The other thing about borax, which has boron in it, is that you can use it to make this substance called oobleck. And oobleck comes from the story from Dr. Seuss. So Dr. Seuss had this story about this substance called oobleck. It's really interesting, and there are a lot of good themes to this story, and kind of the overall message of the story has a lot of different aspects to it that we can learn from. So if you haven't read that, I'm not going to go through the story here, but it talks about grief. It talks about greed. It talks about gratitude, honesty, forgiveness, care for yourself, care for others. All of those things can be discussed. And I remember reading that story to a middle school class when we did an experiment. I taught middle school long ago. I teach high school now, but I did do that in middle school and read that story to them. And they really got a lot from that story as far as just philosophy, but also as far as science is concerned. We were talking about liquids and solids and phases of matter. And so anyway, boron is used in fireworks as well. And the interesting thing about that is it gives off this green glow when put in fireworks, but it's kind of dazzling. So just like the magician creates that illusory feel and distracts us in a way. And that's something to watch for. And I think that when the Hierophant comes up in a reading, those are the things to look for. We need to look for places in our lives where we might be blindly following something. There may be some tradition that no longer serves us. Or it could be that there is something that we can look at that is a tradition that might work for us and keep us on a good, stable path. So that's up to you and based on the other cards that come up in the reading. But I think that overall, we can always go to our inner guidance and find out which direction we should go with that.